All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys. Once again, for the first time in a very long time, I have on the line Trevor Timm. He is the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and they have the excellent URL freedom.press. Welcome back to the show. How you doing, Trevor?
Thanks for having me back, Scott. It's good to be back.
Yeah, man, good to have you here. And, well, what a great site you guys have here. I've been trolling through it this morning. You got lots of great stuff. But, of course, I want to talk with you all about Julian Assange. Who's Julian Assange, and why should anyone listening to this care about that?
Well, I'm guessing most of your listeners know who Julian Assange is. But for those who don't, of course, he is the founder of the whistleblowing and transparency site WikiLeaks. Which started back in 2007, 2008, and most famously released hundreds of thousands of war logs from Iraq and Afghanistan in 2010, and then State Department cables that same year. And for the past few years, Julian Assange has been locked up in Belmarsh prison in London, awaiting extradition to the United States, because the Trump administration decided to charge him with 17 counts under the Espionage Act for publishing government secrets. And it will, if people are not paying attention to it now, they will soon be, because it is very likely that in the next 6 months or so, Julian Assange may be extradited to the United States, and there will be a huge trial that will not only decide his fate, but that could decide the fate of press freedom in this country.
All right, now, we could do a whole show about the heroism of Julian Assange and the importance of the leaks that he has published. But we've done that before. People are just going to have to check the record. But what's important here is what you just said about what it means for everybody else. What is the big deal that makes this case so important compared to the government picking on everybody, which they do all the time?
Well, I think it's first important to acknowledge that Julian Assange is a controversial figure, very controversial figure in the United States. There are a lot of people that acknowledge and say that he's a hero. There are a lot of other people who think he is some sort of villain character for the role that WikiLeaks played in the 2016 election. And there's also Republicans that hate him too. He is a widely reviled person in DC, which is part of the reason why the Justice Department probably thinks that they can get away with this case. So, as a press freedom advocate, I have long been worried about the Espionage Act, the 100-year-old law passed during World War I to go after dissenters and anti-war activists, which is still somehow on the books and has never been ruled unconstitutional. We've long been worried this could be used against reporters who go and talk to sources within the U.S. government that get so-called classified information, and then who publish it on the front pages of our nation's newspapers. The worry has always been the government could use this law to put those journalists in jail. So far, they never have. There's been a bunch of close calls, but they've never fully done so because they have partly been worried about the backlash, and partly they probably know deep down that it violates the First Amendment. Now, what they have here is this controversial figure who people argue over: is this person a journalist? Is he not a journalist? And the Trump administration, who of course has had no qualms about protecting journalist rights, or violating journalist rights, I should say, brought these charges where even the Obama administration wouldn't. And we have a situation now where the Biden administration is continuing this case, which the Trump administration first brought. And we could end up with a situation where essential acts like speaking with a source, asking the source for more information, receiving documents from a source, and publishing those documents actually becomes outlawed. That's the danger with this precedent, that whether you think Julian Assange is the best journalist in the world, the worst journalist in the world, or no journalist at all, what he was engaging in were acts of journalism. If those acts of journalism can be outlawed or ruled illegal by a jury and a judge, then those same acts of journalism, when you're at the New York Times and Washington Post, can just as easily be outlawed as well. And so that is the worry, that essentially.
Are you trying to talk me into it now, or? I'd like to
What'd you
see.
say?
I just would like to see terrible things happen to the guys at the Post and the Times. And they're the worst. It's the other people I'm concerned about. But no, I hear you, and I'm just joshing around. Listen, there's so many things I want to go over here or ask you about here. So first of all, what in the world does the Espionage Act or the First Amendment have to do with this Australian, right? How do either of these things apply to this guy? And then also, if I remember it right, and I do, Barack Obama prosecuted more leakers under the Espionage Act than every president from Woodrow Wilson through W. Bush that came before him. And so there must have been some real important reason, Trevor, that I'm trying to understand why Obama would not go so far as to go ahead and indict this guy who his government obviously hated so much. And then also, I guess, if you could address the fact that Donald Trump supposedly was this wild aberration. I mean, you listen to these people tell it was the Russians who installed him in power and everything anyway. So if Obama wouldn't indict him, and this wild Tasmanian devil character who never belonged in the presidency at all, Donald Trump, was the one who indicted him, then why wouldn't Joe Biden and the Democrats just throw that right back out again?
All good questions. Well, let's take them one at a time. We can start with Obama. You're right. Obama prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other presidents combined, at least at the time. Donald Trump gave him a run for his money a few years later. But still, it was a betrayal of what Obama promised during his initial campaign in 2018. Yet still, all of the whistleblowers and sources of journalists that Obama prosecuted were quite distinct from Julian Assange, because they were all government employees. They had all signed secrecy agreements. Essentially, the government has a much different relationship with them than they do the rest of the citizens. They have more power over their own employees. Now, that's not to say that Obama's prosecutions of all these whistleblowers wasn't horribly wrong. It was. But the law treats them much differently. Generally courts have allowed, even though it's appalling, the government to prosecute the sources who are the government employees. But once journalists receive that information, even if it's stolen, even if they know it's been stolen, as long as they themselves did not directly participate in the stealing of documents, journalists have a First Amendment right, which the Supreme Court has said over and over again, to publish these documents. And so Julian Assange fits in that part of the equation. He was, of course, never a U.S. government employee. He talked to U.S. government employees and published documents from them. So he has the same rights as any other journalist does. Now, you asked about his citizenship in Australia and the fact that he was in different countries. This is actually an argument that people who hate Assange bring up all the time. They're like, oh, well, he doesn't deserve First Amendment rights. He's Australian. Well, the good thing about our Constitution is that it doesn't just apply to U.S. citizens. It applies to, first of all, anybody who is in the United States and anybody who is outside the United States with which the U.S. government is trying to prosecute. So, when people make this argument, they barely think about it at all, because, of course, the idea that the U.S. government could prosecute whoever they wanted outside the United States, bring them to the United States, and that person wouldn't have constitutional rights, that they wouldn't, have access to a lawyer, that they, could be essentially, all of their belongings could be seized without a warrant, that they could be tortured. Now, now that I'm saying this, it sounds like the U.S. government has made these arguments in the past, which surely they have. But it should go without saying that everybody, no matter who they are in the U.S. courtroom, has the same rights. And so Julian Assange has those same First Amendment rights you and I do to have this conversation right now. And what the U.S. government is trying to do is curtail those rights, which would then curtail the rights of everybody else.
Mm-hmm. And in the words of the law, as long as it's the executive branch of the U.S. government reaching out to touch him, the DOJ trying to take custody of him, then that makes him a U.S. person, which means he's just as protected in his rights as me, supposedly. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then, and now what about the part about where Trump is this aberration? He did not belong there. That was Hillary Clinton's rightful throne, or maybe Jeb Bush's. But whatever he did ought to be null and void according to the narrative of the entire American political establishment. So how come not in this case? When, again, even Obama wouldn't go this far, and he loved going that far.
Yeah, I mean, in the Obama, as you alluded to before, the Obama administration, naturally, they hated Julian Assange, right? Like the biggest releases in the history of WikiLeaks happened during the Obama administration. They were a giant headache for the Obama administration. And you would think if anybody would want to prosecute WikiLeaks, it would be them. Well, we know their Justice Department looked at it closely. This is all reported on in the Washington Post. Their Justice Department looked at it closely, and there were lawyers within, and even the up until the Attorney General said, we can't prosecute WikiLeaks without violating the First Amendment. We can't prosecute WikiLeaks without making the New York Times or any other newspaper in the United States vulnerable to prosecution too. And so they ultimately declined. Trump dusted off that indictment or that research and decided to flip it on its head and indicted Julian Assange almost 10 years after the releases in 2010 and 2011 for that same for the same thing the Obama administration declined. And you would think that if the Biden administration was actually serious about its commitment to press freedom, which it's stated multiple times, that they would take a look at this case and they would drop it. Now, the Biden administration hides behind, well, we don't interfere in Justice Department policy. And the Justice Department hides behind the fact that, well, we brought this case before, so, we're not just going to drop every single case that the other administration brought, and that we still believe in press freedom, which, is hard to take them at face value, because we know there are even Justice Department lawyers in the Justice Department during the Trump administration who thought this was going to violate the First Amendment. That played out in the media as well. And so they are playing with fire here. Thankfully, the Biden administration, besides this glaring omission, has been relatively good on press freedom. We haven't seen them really bring leak cases like the previous two administrations. They've changed their guidelines to make it harder for the FBI to spy on journalists. But it doesn't even matter. Like, say you trust Biden 100%. You've never loved the president more than Joe Biden. He would never do that to journalists. Well, we know that the parties in the White House switch spots at least every 8 years, probably every 4 years. And Donald Trump, for example, who has made a career of saying journalists are the enemies of the people and that he wants them in jail. Well, you're just handing him the keys, the perfect way to throw all the reporters that he doesn't like in jail, and then vice versa for the Democrats. So, this is a monumental mistake that could have ramifications for years and decades to come if it actually goes through.
Yeah. And, you would think that the conservatives would have learned the lesson when they got Homeland Security and the FBI going after them for their politics, that whose Homeland Security and FBI departments and agencies are these, right?
I mean, it's a great point. Like, why would Republicans want to give Democrats or Democratic Justice Department that power to go after conservative or libertarian journalists. Like we saw, for example, during the Obama administration, they in one indictment they called a Fox News reporter an unindicted co-conspirator under the Espionage Act, which is just one small step away from actually charging somebody from Fox News.
And
so,
that was total BS, right? Like it was just straight. He did a good news story about
yeah,
developments in
exactly.
Korea.
He was being a reporter. He was
Right.
talking to a source. And so it's certainly, I think that people who are afraid of a second Donald Trump administration should be incredibly worried about this. But I think people from all political parties should be very worried about this, because the First Amendment is there as a safety valve, a last resort piece of accountability. When the rest of the government breaks down, we can still have private citizens who can expose these secrets. And if that is destroyed, then whether you are on the right or on the left or anywhere in between, our way of communicating and holding our government accountable is also destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Hang on just one second. Hey, y'all, the audiobook of my book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, is finally done. Yes, of course, read by me. It's available at Audible, Amazon, Apple Books, and soon on Google Play and whatever other options there are out there. It's my history of America's war on terrorism from 1979 through today. Give it a listen and see if you agree. It's time to just come home. Enough Already. Time to End the War on Terrorism. The audiobook. Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education. Hey, so tell me this. Before, I guess, they've had them, a few of them here and there. There's Ellsberg, of course, and a couple others. But before the modern era of, the terror wars, W. Bush and Obama especially, how do they handle leakers? Because it seems like espionage, that means spying on behalf of an enemy. There must be other laws that they can use against these people when they leak to reporters in violation of their secrecy agreement. Is there some kind of substantive reason I should understand why they're using the Espionage Act? Never even mind against Assange here, but even, let's say, against Drake or any of these other guys who were government employees and leaked to the media. Thomas Tam or one of those guys.
It's a great question. I think partly they're using the Espionage Act because it's this incredibly broad law, and it really ties the defendants' hands behind their back. Like, we talk about fair trials in the United States. It just makes the trial totally unfair. So, for example, say you were a whistleblower who saw the government engaged in blatantly illegal conduct, and you go to a journalist and you give them the information and they publish it. The government can prosecute you, and they could say, you are not allowed to tell the jury your motive for leaking this information. So you couldn't tell the jury that, oh, I saw the government doing something illegal and I was being a patriot and I wanted to make sure that they were held accountable. That would be ruled inadmissible. The only thing that matters is if you leaked it to them. It doesn't matter why. And so this, basically destroys the defense of all of these whistleblowers because, they would like to admit that they actually did this, but they would like to tell the jury why. And we have a situation where, the government doesn't actually need to prosecute these leakers and these whistleblowers to, uphold secrecy. Just think about how they've done it in the past. You're right. Before Ellsberg and even decades after Ellsberg, there was no prosecutions under the Espionage Act, because they can easily punish people by firing them, by ruining their careers. Even getting investigated ends up costing these government employees
but
so
are
much
there
money in legal costs.
are there other
There's all
laws?
sorts of.
Are there other laws though lesser than the Espionage Act that they were previously prosecuted under?
Not really. There's never been a. There's very specific laws. So if we're talking about communications intelligence or we're talking about nuclear secrets, there's very specific laws around that kind of information. But basically, they like using the Espionage Act because it's this catch-all that allows them to essentially do whatever they want. There are a couple statutes that like theft of government information and things like that that they could potentially use and have occasionally used in the past along with the Espionage Act. But thankfully in this country we've never had an Official Secrets Act. The classification system is just done by executive order. That's why it doesn't apply to United States citizens. It only applies to U.S. government employees. The executive branch can only really totally rule over its own employees without getting Congress involved. And so, the government has plenty of tools at its disposal to keep its secrets. It shouldn't have to, declare its employees spies to do so.
Yeah. All right. Now, so I know you're a lawyer and good at this stuff, and there's a couple superseding indictments, or one indictment and a superseding one. And somebody listening to this is going to say, but listen, the New York Times test does not apply here because Assange went further than an investigative journalist does. He helped Manning hack DOD computers and get those files. And so that makes him a stealer and a leaker, not just a leaky and a publisher. And so everything you just said is null and void. What about that?
Well, it's a great question because this is kind of the magic trick or the sleight of hand that DOJ has tried to do. In their press release, they say, oh, Julian Assange is a hacker, not a journalist. So when you look at the indictment closely, there are 18 charges in the indictment. 17 of them are Espionage Act related. And one of them is this sort of conspiracy to hack or conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charge. So all of the actions that are involved in the 17 Espionage Act charges have nothing to do with hacking. So all of the documents that Julian Assange got from Chelsea Manning, the U.S. government doesn't even allege that he hacked at all. Those are all documents that Chelsea got herself, that she gave Julian under her own free will, and they had conversations about them. Only after the fact, there was this one incident, like after Julian had already gotten all the documents, where they had discussed trying to help Chelsea mask her identity by gaining access to the same type of documents in a different realm. There's also they try to throw a whole bunch of stuff against the wall involving other incidents that have nothing to do with this case, involving an FBI informant. But that's neither here nor there. I think the hacking charge is weird and it's weak. It wouldn't necessarily imperil journalism. But these 17 other charges have zero to do with any sort of hacking allegations at all. And the U.S. government is essentially trying to take that one conspiracy to hack charge and mask all these other charges with it.
Mm-hmm. And then, if I understand it right, even from the information in the indictment, it's clear, or maybe not just from the indictment itself, but from journalism and the rest of information out there about this, that in fact, whatever testimony, I guess, that he didn't hack anything at all, right? He tried to give Manning, I forgot exactly what it was. Maybe you remember the details better, but it was nothing like, let me crack that password for you so you can steal more data from me or anything like that. Would have been sort of the accusation, but the facts really are nothing like that, right?
They had a single conversation about this, which again happened after Chelsea Manning had already given WikiLeaks everything, and they had already had all their conversations, and nothing actually came of it.
Mm-hmm.
So none of those documents that WikiLeaks published were taken by hacking involving WikiLeaks at all. Even the U.S. government.
And then, Trevor, in that conversation, is that what they were talking about? How to get more data, or I thought it was more about
it was
covering Manning's
hard to
tracks.
tell. It was very vague. Basically, it seemed like Chelsea wanted to hide her tracks because she didn't want people to catch her. And so she was trying to figure out, can I log in through another name and hide my identity? And they alleged that Julian or somebody at WikiLeaks offered to help with this, but then nothing ever came of it.
Right. I mean, so that's huge right there, right? That all this was a theoretical discussion of some OPSEC that they never did, and the government doesn't even know who was on the WikiLeaks side of the chat.
Right.
Great indictment, guys. Yeah.
Exactly. And the rest of whatever they're saying about the Espionage Act and the Espionage Act charges doesn't even have to do with that conversation. It only has to do with Julian Assange speaking with her on an encrypted messaging service and asking her questions and receiving the documents, which of course, that's conduct that journalists engage in every single day.
Yeah. All right. Now, Trevor, look, this show is mostly about bad things the U.S. government does elsewhere in the world, of course. But one thing that America has been very good on, just because they have to, because Madison made it this way, is freedom of speech. And even though they're very cynical in the way that they, criticize other countries for violating their citizens' rights, they got a leg to stand on here, usually, mostly. And I read in this piece that you have up at your site here, I'm sorry, let me say the guy's name. Seth Stern wrote this piece here. And he mentions how, one, we can't really say anything, or everybody just laughs when America criticizes the Russians for kidnapping this Wall Street Journal reporter, which I don't know the facts of the case, but they're not going to use a Wall Street Journal reporter as a knock. That's, a non-official cover spy over there. They're not going to do that. That just sounds wrong. But the Americans can't really say much about it. And then I think he says in here that the Chinese are even citing America's prosecution of Assange to say, see, it's okay if we do it too. Even the Americans do it.
Yeah, it is just totally hypocritical when we're going around. And, as much as I criticize the U.S. government all the time, they can do a lot of good work abroad promoting free expression. But when they turn into, the biggest hypocrites in the world, where they're prosecuting somebody for publishing documents under espionage, but then they're saying, the reporter in Russia who's charged with Espionage Act was just doing their job as a reporter, it rings really empty, which, by the way, is all true. The Wall Street Journal reporter who is being held in Russia right now in jail for espionage charges, there is absolutely zero evidence that he was doing nothing other than doing his job. And it's outrageous that Russia is holding him. But it's just as outrageous that the U.S. is trying to pull this off here. And it makes their efforts to try to free this reporter just ring completely hollow and makes them look like hypocrites. And so, the best thing they could do for this Wall Street Journal reporter who's in jail in Russia, or any other journalists who China might want to throw in jail, is to drop these charges against Julian Assange and say, look, hey, we're at least trying to live by our values here. We're not being complete hypocrites.
Yeah. All right. And one last thing here real quick, which is sort of the lead that we buried to the very end here, which is Australian politicians are finally getting the gumption to try to say and do something about this. Do you think there's a real chance that Julian would be set free?
It's really fascinating because, here in the United States, it's hard for us to gauge Australian news. But when you talk to people in Australia, this is front page news all the time. And you'll notice when you look at the political parties of the politicians that have come over here this week, it's every major political party in Australia. So it's not just like the Green Party or the far right party. It is the Labour Party, the mainstream Conservative Party, across the political spectrum. It's because Australians are basically united. I saw one poll that was like 88% of Australians believe that Julian Assange needs to come back to Australia, and the U.S. needs to drop the charges. So these politicians have been hearing from their constituents and are over here because they're responding to them. Next month, the Australian Prime Minister is coming over here for a state visit, and so that should be really interesting. And it really seems like the Australian government is starting to put more and more pressure on the U.S. government to bring an end to this case, given it involves one of their citizens.
Yeah. All right, man, you're great. Thanks so much for your time on the show again, Trevor. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. Talk to you soon.
All right, you guys, that's Trevor Timm. He is the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Their website is freedom.press. And check out this great piece by Seth Stern over there. Prosecuting Assange threatens press freedom. U.S. officials should not need the Australians to explain that to them. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in L.A., APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.